Good to be with you today. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And we are now really in the thick of On Revolution. Of course, that sentence has many different connotations today in 2025. Um, but we are reading Hannah Arendt's 1963 book, On Revolution. Uh, to me, one of her greatest books. And certainly, as I've said a number of times, I think the one most relevant, most important for us to confront and think about today. Primarily because, as I've said a number of times, um, we really are uh, in what she would call a revolutionary situation. In many ways, the same revolutionary situation we were in back in the 1960s when she first wrote this book. Um, and this book, therefore, is in many ways um, an attempt to understand why we're in a revolutionary situation and how we might get out of it. Uh, for her, the great failure of the American Revolution in the end is its loss of authority. We can see that in the loss of authority that we have for the Constitution, which is patently visible today um, on both the left and the right, but certainly currently highlighted on the right. Um, and the question is it possible to refound that authority? We will get to that much more directly in chapters 4 and 5, where she's expressly framing that question. Um, but what it means is that we do have to understand that once authority is lost, once authority is broken, once the pillars of authority and the pillars of the world have shattered, um, it's a real question of how to put it back together again. And that for her is the question of revolution, right? How do we um, uh, refound a political system? And the book is set up as an exploration of two different revolutionary traditions, the American and the French. Um, the French is the one that has dominated revolutionary history. She thinks, and I think she's right. Um, and in doing so, she thinks it has um, led the revolutionary tradition down a false path, namely the path of um, social revolutions as opposed to political revolutions. In other words, for all the main revolutionaries in both the French and the American Revolution were originally interested in the foundation of freedom. But she thinks that the French Revolution um, abandoned that trajectory of freedom and instead sought to found a different kind of um, revolution, not based on freedom, but based on freedom from need or happiness. Um, and that means that the social question, the question of social happiness, of equality, uh, social equality in the sense of economic and status equality, came to be the sort of source and the energy behind revolutions, as opposed to the political idea of freedom. And so uh, we have this long, very long. It's by far the longest chapter in the book. Chapter on the social question. Um, that is her attempt to understand where the French Revolution and thus the revolutionary tradition went wrong. Um, where did the revolutionary tradition go wrong in seeking to in forgetting that revolutions are about the experience of freedom and the foundation of freedom instead of the foundation of happiness? Um, we read last week the first three parts of this social question. And by the way, I should say that, I think this is one of her most controversial chapters in her writing, and it's one that's generally looked down upon by many Arendt scholars as well as Arendt critics. Um, and for the most part, though, uh, people only read the first one or two sections of this chapter. This chapter has 6 sections. And so, what we talked about last week, I think, is what is mostly read, right? That the reason for the success of the American Revolution, but also the reason for its failure in the end, and its failure to become determinative for other revolutions, was that she says that for the American founders, the predicament of poverty was absent from the American scene, even though it was present everywhere else. And so, because the predicament of poverty did not touch the founders, they didn't focus on the social question, they focused on the political question of freedom. Now, she makes 2 qualifications for what she calls this sweeping statement, right? The first qualification was, of course, there was poverty in America, but it wasn't visible. And what she means by that is that, yeah, there were poor people, but they weren't miserable. Not in the sense, at least the poor whites were not miserable in the sense that the miserable proletariat was in Europe. And thus, the poor could still be seen as engaged in the political world and worried more about freedom than about happiness. The second great qualification is, of course, slavery, namely that overlooking the abject and degrading misery of slavery, she says, um, was what led the founders to be able to focus not on misery and poverty, but on freedom. She says that slavery is incompatible with freedom, but the Americans didn't see it. They didn't feel pity for the slaves. Um, and, we can ask why. And she has an interesting answer, an answer at least, whether we like it or not, which is that it wasn't a personal failing, right? But it's a result of slavery itself. She says that slavery is so abysmal and so dark that it, in a sense, uh, um, I mean, I think you could say that it dehumanizes slaves to such an extent that it makes their misery invisible. Um, and so she says that these 2 qualifications, right? The that there was poverty but not misery, and that slavery, in a sense, made the misery, the real misery, and the profound misery that was real, invisible. Led to the ability of the American founders to keep their focus on freedom rather than on the social question. She ends with this discussion of compassion and the danger of compassion in politics, and the discussion of Melville's Billy Budd and Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor and Jesus. And she ends the chapter with this haunting quote, I think, where she says, "As a rule, it's not compassion which sets out to change the worldly conditions in order to ease human suffering." Right? We don't usually try and make the world better because of compassion with people, right? But if we do, she says, if we do get motivated by compassion, um, the immediacy of our compassion for the abject, the poor, and the weak means that we feel the need to act immediately, and we shun the drawn out, wearisome processes of persuasion, negotiation, and compromise, which are the processes of law and politics, right? That law and politics are about compromise, persuasion, negotiation. And instead, we lend our voices to suffering itself, which makes claim for a swift and direct action, and that is for action with the means of violence. And so, when compassion does enter the world, it will become violent and revolutionary, and it will drive the revolution not towards freedom, but towards the social question. All right, so that's the review of the first three sections of this chapter on the social question. Um, Chapters 4 through 6, as I said, are often less read. Um, I think partly because they're a little more abstract to people. Um, Also, they are they get a little historical about the French Revolution. But I think what's really the reason they're not read is they go at the fundamental drive of so much of modern politics, which is, as she says, that the poor and the miserable shall inherit the earth or rule the earth or the power of the earth, and tries to show the ultimate danger of it. And because they're consumed with this question of hypocrisy, um, which is something that I think most of her readers suffer from. Um, and as a result, it's a bit too close to home. Um, I've been obsessed with these chapters for a number of years. Maybe I shouldn't say obsessed, but I've been writing about them for a number of years. We had a conference 3 years ago at the Hannah Arendt Center called Rage and Reason, which was inspired by these chapters. And uh, I encourage you to pay attention to them. So let me see if I can um, uh, do them justice. As I said, I think they're pretty complicated, but we'll see what we can do, and hopefully then have a great discussion. So, section 4 of the social question chapter um, is about the difference between compassion, pity, and solidarity. Right? I should say that to me, solidarity is one of the core ideas in Arendt's political thinking. You don't see it mentioned much. And it's not a word she uses all the time. She uses it in this book, and she uses it a fair bit in her Denktagebuch. But it's often a hidden ideal in her politics. And yet, when we think about her work on judgment and the idea of an enlarged mentality and the idea of a common sense or a common world, I do believe that solidarity and her idea of solidarity is absolutely central to what she means by the goal of politics. And here is where she develops that idea, I think, more directly than in any other of her works. And so, if you're interested in her political work, looking at these chapters is very important. So, the first sentence and the first paragraph of the fourth part of the social question begins with Rousseau. And she says that Rousseau likely did not discover compassion out of Mitleid, out of a suffering with others, right? He didn't, and he didn't develop his idea of compassion, right, which he talks a lot about in the second discourse, the discourse on inequality, because he was consumed by and worried about the suffering of others. She says rather he likely discovered it through his own lack of compassion or Mitleid, of suffering with, and the lack of suffering and compassion in the elite and high society, the indifference to suffering by most people in his class, and his rebellion against that indifference. I think an indifference that he himself felt. And so for her, compassion is born of a rebellion against the lack of compassion, right? Compassion is born of rebellion against the lack of compassion. Compassion is born of a rage at the heartlessness of reason. Um, it's a rage at the rationality, at the rationalism that says, perish if you wish, I am secure. A quote from the Discourse on Inequality. Um, Compassion, she thinks, has little, if any, connection to the people who actually suffer. She says instead it's an affair of your heart. It's an emotion, not a passion. And the emotion that compassion is, the sentiment that compassion is pity. So we have to understand what pity is. And pity for her is not the same as compassion. It's the perversion of compassion. This is on page 84 or 89, depending on the version you're using. Um, Pity is, she says, uh, distant, whereas compassion is near. So go think back to the Grand Inquisitor chapter, which we talked about last week. For Jesus, he has compassion for the people as an individual. The Grand Inquisitor looks at the people as a whole, and he says, our job is to control the people, and we give them bread and circus bread and happiness and and we'll control them, but we're not actually focused on each individual suffering person. Pity is aimed at the many, whereas compassion is aimed at the one sufferer. I see someone suffering and I have compassion for them. It's a passion. But if I pity the whole group of sufferers, the poor, I'm worried about the many. And pity is limited to the poor and the weak, whereas uh, compassion can be a compassion for anyone, including the strong and the powerful and the rich. Um, Pity needs the weak. This is where she gets into the heart of her criticism. It has an interest in the poor being poor. Um, Pity never ends when the poor or the sufferers are given rights, right? If you have poor and suddenly you have welfare, you think, well, maybe we don't have to pity the poor anymore because now they have welfare. But no, right? Because pity never ends, because pity doesn't come from the individual sufferer. It comes from those who are in need of pity. And the people in need of pity are the people who feel pity, namely the powerful. It is a need of those who need to feel superior. For those in charge, they need pity to feel like there are people below them. They also need pity to make them feel themselves virtuous in the face of people who they pity. It glorifies the weak, and it needs the suffering of others. She says that pity has a vested interest in the existence of the weak. There's a, there's a, I mean, I think one of the easiest ways to see this is there was a book published a number of years ago by a colleague of mine called Human Rights Incorporated, Human Rights Inc., in which Joseph Slaughter argued that um, uh, human rights activists need uh, the the people without rights so that they have something to keep them busy with and argue for. And so they actually have an interest in preserving people who are rightless, um, and that the human rights industry, as he calls it, um, is geared towards serving but also preserving the rightless, so that they can continue in their jobs. Um, and uh, Pity works very much the same way. Pity is, she says, therefore, more cruel than cruelty itself, because it is without limits. Pity overwhelms the political world of laws and rules. This goes back to what she said at the end of section 3, right? That once pity and compassion enter politics, you throw away the rules because you're driven by the immediacy of pity, and you have to solve the problem through any means necessary. Um, Pity, therefore, is cruel in the sense that it needs to eradicate suffering, and it's limitless in that ends. Everything is permitted. It permits all means and all cruelty and all violence to undo pity. Thus, to eliminate poverty, we can make the poor miserable and lead them into a bureaucratic, paternalistic cage, right? And treat them like animals through welfare and other things, all in the name of compassion and pity, and keeping them alive and well fed. We say we're helping them. We give them welfare. We give them a bureaucracy, but we keep them below us. The goal is to actually always have the poor, always have the pitiable, um, and always therefore feel superior. She cites a line from the Paris Commune appeal to the National Convention in France, which says that this in a positive sense, right? A clever and helpful surgeon must cut off the gangrened limb to save the body, and with his cruel yet benevolent knife. And they actually say this in a positive sense, right? That the revolutionaries, right? The sort of elite revolutionaries are like the clever and helpful surgeon who must um, cut off some part of society um, in order to save the body with his cruel knife. And that's a good thing. We're willing to sacrifice, some for the good of all. We're willing to keep people down as long as we give them something. The more radical the pitying politician, the more he acts violently but speaks from his tender soul, she writes. So this is, I mean, one of the great critiques of pity that you'll ever see, and the entrance of pity into politics. Um, Nietzsche has a similar critique of pity in Zarathustra and other places, but not nearly as caught up in or as concrete as Arendt's is. Um, Hers is a you don't see it very often, and and she engages in this critique of pity, because she thinks that pity is what drives the revolutionaries in France and leads them to the terror. And second, because she wants to contrast it with not only compassion, which she thinks of as a worthy passion, but one that is apolitical. It becomes pity when it enters into politics. But more importantly, she wants to contrast it with solidarity, which she sees as the alternative to pity. Solidarity, she writes on pages 84 or 79, depending on what edition you're in, is conceptual. It's an idea and it partakes of reason or generality, and it applies to a whole class or a nation or humanity. Thus, unlike pity, solidarity applies to the strong and the rich no less than the weak and the poor. Um, Pity has an interest in the weak and it needs the weak, right? Whereas solidarity actually wants to raise all people up to what she calls the grandeur of man. Solidarity thus speaks to all men, not just the poor, and it speaks to the human interest in grandeur and dignity of man, not in simply the social interests of the poor. Solidarity is thus a principle that can inspire and guide action, she thinks, whereas pity is a sentiment, a mere pretext for the lust for power. Um, there's much that can be said more here, but I'm gonna move on just out of the interest in time. I'll just say that she here offers a contrast to the American Revolution, right? Whereas since the American Revolution sought a direction that was in the direction of lasting institutions of freedom, it sought to raise the law and respect for the law above the unbounded sentiments and actions driven by pity. Um, and thus, she says there was a horror in America at the reign of terror in France that was even greater than the horror in Europe. Um, one lesson she drives from this is that the American revolutionaries rejected public opinion. She saw then and I think now that public opinion is a form of tyranny. Um, she cites here Jefferson, who says that to make us one nature as to far that our goal is to make us have one nature as a country with regard to foreign concerns in foreign affairs, but keep us distinct in domestic ones, right? This is about the idea that in America you had many different factions, many different um, states, and each state would govern itself. You didn't need one public opinion. She cites Madison on this as well, that the principal task of legislation involves the spirit of party and faction in the operation of government. This is a reference to Federalist 10, in which Madison says that, we can't get rid of faction. And in fact, we should understand that faction can make us stronger when we understand how to control its effects rather than get rid of it. And she thinks that the American Revolution is to be lauded for its willingness to bring faction and plurality into into its politics. Um, as opposed to that, the French Revolution um, uh, was consumed with abject poverty and the attempt to speak unanimously or in one voice to get rid of poverty. Um, and this for her was the great mistake of the French Revolution. She does here offer a criticism of the American revolutionaries, right, as well, which should not be forgotten, in which she says that the American Revolution, because it didn't see misery and because it didn't see slavery and because it kept those things at a distance, it was like a revolution in an ivory tower where human misery and abject poverty never penetrated. That's on page 90 or 85, right? She says that the common sense of the American revolutionaries was never exposed to the absurdity of their hope that man might be an angel. And their lack of experience gives their theories an air of lightheartedness and weightlessness that jeopardizes their durability. The American revolutionaries don't see that sentiments and desires, right, which the French were consumed by, while they may be irrational, can't simply be written out of humanity and human government. And so this is the short-sightedness of sort of the American project. But, right, and here she turns around again, she says, we still have to understand that the greatest danger is bringing sentiments into politics. And she then goes into this section on the secret passions of the human heart from 91 or 87 forward. Uh, the human heart, and these are profound pages. The human heart, she wants to say, is a place of darkness, right? In our heart, we have all sorts of motivations, desires. No human eye can penetrate the heart. And we can't ever let the heart and our motivations out into the public. They are our innermost motives. However deeply felt a motive is, um, it is false in the light of day. It becomes an object of suspicion. If I say I'm acting out of generosity, or even if I say I'm acting out of hubris, when I do something, don't believe what I say about my motives, right? The true source of why I act is always going to be hidden. Um, and so she says, we really shouldn't look at motives in politics. Uh, Modern research into motivations is an eerie sort of filing cabinet for human vices, right? She says, once virtue becomes associated with compassion and pity, the virtues of the heart, we see intrigue and calumny and treachery and hypocrisy everywhere. Once you start looking for motivations, you're going to disbelieve anyone's good motivations and you're going to assume everybody you know, is actually pursuing their power. And so suspicion becomes our dominant mode of engaging with others. And not only with others, also with ourselves. We begin to question our own motivations and question ourselves. And we lose trust in ourselves and we lose trust in others. We trust no one. Once we really start looking into the heart and looking at motivations, we realize no one is reliable. And our heart is broken or torn in this conflict. And this leads to our sense that we are unreliable individually. I am unreliable. I am corrupt. I am a hypocrite. And if I think I am a hypocrite and I am corrupt and I am unreliable, I'm going to think everyone else is a hypocrite, corrupt, and unreliable as well. And so she quotes one of the historians of the French Revolution, R.R. Palmer, here saying that the hunt for hypocrites is boundless and can produce nothing but demoralization. Once you start thinking that everyone, including yourself, is a hypocrite, um, there's no one left. Everything is corrupt. Everything is corrupted. And so the task of the revolutionaries who are driven by the emotions and the sentiments, the French revolutionaries, is to prove their purity, to unmask the hypocrite. The problem is that that leaves only what she says that, and she goes into this is now in section 5. What she goes into this analysis of what a person is, and a persona, from the Latin persona, which means per, through, sonare, to sound, is what sounds through, right? The persona is the mask that an actor um, wore, and there was a place in which the mouth, the sound, could come through. Um, and so the actor was someone who took on a different persona. The Roman citizen was a person, right? That's where our word person comes from. And the idea is that every citizen wears a mask. They're not a they're not an individual. They're not, you know, uh, who they are. They're a mask. They're a citizen. And as a citizen, they have certain rights. But if you start tearing the mask off people, all you're left with is the natural person. You lose any kind of sense of a political equality, of that we're all citizens, and we're left with just the natural person beneath it. And she says that Rousseau unleashed a war on hypocrisy through this hunt for hypocrites, and the revolution proceeded to unmask and devour its children until no one is left who does not stand accused, or at least suspected, of hypocrisy, corruption, duplicity, and mendacity. And I think we can all see that in ourselves, and our look at, they're all corrupt. They're all, I have a tendency to say it, right, and it's true. We see everybody as corrupt today. And it was this war on hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is then seen as the vice of vices. Why? Because it shows the utter corruption of people. Um, why is hypocrisy, which is usually a minor vice in history, seen as the vice of vices in our rage-infused modern politics? She asks on page 96 or 91. Her answer is that amongst hypocrites, the charge of corruption fails because the whole world is corrupt. This is similar to Nietzsche's insistence that truth is a lie, and Foucault's claim that truth is power. Arendt agrees with them. But against Foucault, right, who says that all truth is power, against Foucault, says that critique, in the sense that Kant understand it, which is a limit of what we can know, but we still, in the critical project, we still pursue to get to truth, or as close to truth, and that limit we can know of truth. That's Kant's Enlightenment critical project of the Enlightenment, of Aufklärung, right? Foucault changes the meaning of critique, which is a full rejection of truth, and that freedom, the freedom that critique brings, is not getting closer to my own autonomous truth, but a liberation from all discourses, right? A constant critique. And critical theory, therefore, shifts from Kantian critical theory, right, which is towards a limit closer to truth, to a constant rejection of all truth as manifestations of power, and thus manifestations of hypocrisy. It's amidst this loss of truth in which we come to suspect everyone of being in it for power and corruption, and that the hunt for hypocrites is hard to stop. In the last section, section 6, Arendt talks about how the natural man, the malheureux, what they really want is that people are shorn of hypocrisy. They take over. And when this force of nature was let loose, she writes on page 106 or 100, when this force of nature was let loose, when everybody had become convinced that only naked need and interest were without hypocrisy, right? You understand what's happening in the world today, right? The only thing that's true is naked need and interest. who does that sound like, right? It's at that point that the the poor change into the enraged, because rage is indeed the only form in which their misfortune can become active. Once hypocrisy is unmasked, right? It's not that we suddenly end up with people who are virtuous, because everyone is a hypocrite. And what we see is that the only thing that's not hypocritical is utter corruption. And so we respect the corrupt. We respect the demagogue who simply says, I'm honest because I'm corrupt. And thus vengeance, right, becomes core to this new idea, because the enraged are so angry that they refuse to bear their suffering, but they're unable to actually get what they want, to get justice. Justice becomes unreachable. If justice is unreachable, all we have left is vengeance. If justice is impotent, if rage can't lead to justice, what it can do is at least destroy our enemies. And we take joy in the vengeful destruction of our enemies. Robespierre and his fellow revolutionaries, she says, knew that while they claimed to fight for equality, they were also wedded to their privileges, right? They wanted equality, but they also wanted to be in charge. And they knew that the progress towards justice was hard, if not impossible, right? They knew that they would never get to justice. And so they sought to prove themselves worthy of the support of the people, she thinks, not by accomplishing justice, but by showing themselves to be more morally virtuous in their demands for justice than were others. They stopped seeking justice and sought to channel the rage of the people, because the rage of the people showed themselves to be morally virtuous. And thus the revolutionaries compete to present themselves as morally pure. The question is not who will actually make the miserable less miserable. It's not who will make the poor less poor. It's who will make the poor happier, because their rage will find a target. And any backsliding or any hesitation on any politician shows a lack of commitment. Everyone becomes suspicious. Even I become suspicious to myself, she thinks, for all politicians, and thus leads to a kind of terror in politics. And we've seen that terror in politics on the left through cancel culture, and now in the right through cancel culture. The hunt for hypocrites is boundless and can produce nothing but demoralization, she writes on page 93. I think this is some of the most important pages that she writes in order to understand what's going on in our politics. The charge of hypocrisy, she says, is so encompassing that no one can escape it. The demand is that everybody display in public his innermost motivation, since it actually demands the impossible. It transforms all actors into hypocrites. This is on page 93. The moment the display of motives becomes hypocrisy, it begins to poison all human relations. And I think now you can see the rage of the MAGA voter, right, is driven less by a claim to justice. It's actually unclear what the MAGA voter wants, than a resentful fury at hypocritical elites. Elites who would integrate public schools while sending their own children to private schools, right? Or defund the police while hiring private security guards for their own homes and communities. Or welcoming undocumented workers into their homes without paying a fair wage or health or care benefits. And there's a rage at the hypocrisy by the left. Many who suffer from a kind of Trump derangement syndrome, right? And they play the same gauge. They have rage at those who would dare to solve the problem of education by creating charter schools or teaching phonics, because somehow this violates abstract tenets of equality. and they have rage at those who applying the law equally, because they think applying the law equally somehow does justice to the fact that people aren't equal. And they have a rage at those, especially those who are fellow travelers on the left, who dare to express heterodox opinions or seek practical solutions. The left, I think, is agog or enraged at Trump's hypocrisy, right? His ability to parade as a truth teller and advocate for the working man. But what they don't see is that both sides are consumed now by a politics of rage. And that this politics of rage, as Arendt says, comes from the fact that we feel impotent to actually solve the problems of justice, social justice, and we therefore seek to present ourselves as virtuous and enraged actors instead of actually trying to solve insolvable problems. All of this comes from the fundamental mistake of moving from a political revolution seeking to found freedom to a social revolution that seeks to found social justice or happiness. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Like I said, this is a profound and difficult and very rich set of readings at the end of this section on the social question. I think it's absolutely essential to understand Arendt. Clearly, it's one that goes against the tenor of much of the age, and has been incredibly controversial in the reception of her work. But we should at least take it seriously and try and understand it, which is our goal in this group. So, with that said, I already see a bunch of questions because this is such a I think a provocative set of chapters like last week was. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions brief so that as many people can get in as they'd like. Also, if there were people who had hands up last week that didn't get called on and have their hands up now, let me know if I'm not getting to you so I can make sure to get to you, or let Yana know and she'll remind me. And we'll go there. So you can engage in a chat in the chat. Please do be respectful. You can disagree, but do so respectfully. And you can also go down to the react button, click on raise hand, and engage that way. I look forward to the conversation. Bill, good to see you. You're up.
Yes, a great pleasure to be here, Roger. And this was published in '63, correct?
Correct.
And I imagine that what I'm about to say has been hashed over so many times. But, it goes all back to the question that I feel that Ms. Arendt, somehow or other, she and I missed each other. And sometimes I feel that for such a brilliant woman, there's a kind of an ignorance in her. Let's go back, and this is a moment I just want to go back to in your synopsis of the take on what was different in the American Revolution. Quote, they just didn't see see slavery. What she says about the Americans, and in other words, they were so involved in their own situation, they just didn't see the agony. What about, and let's just talk about this for a moment. Maybe this is boring to people, since going back to what happened around George Floyd and all. What about just the fact that people are racist? Did she have an idea that people just did not think blacks were humans? Never mind that slavery was so abysmal and da 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 da. They had no pity for them. They didn't think they were people. Now, that is important to me because a lot of her, an invitation to me to come in means I have to accept that definition of what was different about the American Revolution. What about me saying to friends at the time, that heated time, we all remember, racism in this country comes in with mother's milk. Boom. And then I would take another more dangerous comparison to say, for the Jewish people on this call, do you think anti-Semitism is because people just don't understand something about Jews? Or is it something that is deeply part of who they are and their psyche? Um, to get these questions right, to follow her thinking, I need to feel that I can trust that she knows what she is talking about. And it isn't just fashion. It isn't this era only, but I don't know really as a descendant of slaves how to participate in a conversation that's predicated on the fact that, oh, slavery, they just didn't see slavery. They didn't see black people as people. Let's go there. Okay, that is all I want to say. I'm sure there are more important things that people want to say, but can you just address that for a moment? It,
Yes, and I don't think there's much more important, Bill. I think that's this goes to the heart of um so much in her work and also in our lives. So I think it's absolutely essential. Um and 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 so let me do the best I can, right? Because I'm not sure I have a full answer to it. Um you ask a great question, or a good question, which is okay, she says they didn't see slavery. And you're saying, well, wasn't it really the case that they were racist and didn't see black people? Right? I think
or
that's a,
they were not human.
yeah, they saw black people as inhuman, right? And, um, and by the way, I think the analogy you brought up with Jewish anti-Semitism is a good one, right? And, she, again, for better or worse, reads anti-Semitism and racism in parallel. Um, Whether that's right or not is a question I think that's fascinating. I generally think she's right, but I'm not 100% committed to that. And so uh one of the provocations of her writing on anti-Semitism, right, is that there's a difference between Jew hatred, right, and anti-Semitism as an ideology, right?
I
Um,
have had major fights recently in Paris with my husband, who is Jewish, and his brother. And when I try that, they say bullshit.
I get it. I don't. A lot of people don't want to hear it. Just like a lot of people don't want to hear her other argument, right? That there's a difference between um anti-black racism and discrimination, or the ideology of racism. Um and and I think that I think that there's a lot of reasons for people to disagree with her, but it's I'm just this is her framework for viewing these things. um I think there's a lot of reasons for that, right? And part of it is that she thinks that there was Jew hatred long before there was anti-Semitism, right? That's part of the argument of origins. um Uh, and I think she thinks there was hatred based on different races, long before there was the ideology of modern American anti-black racism. Um, Here in section 5 and 6, where she talks about actually section 4, I apologize. She talks about the danger of motives and the difficulty of ascribing motives, right? So you said something along the lines of, wasn't this just that they were racist? And I think her answer is maybe. But we don't really know people's motives. And once we go searching for motives, um, you know, uh, we get all we get caught up in trying to understand people's inner motivations. We don't get very far. And so she has this crazy line. I mean, I've struggled over this line. I really have. And I don't know exactly what to do with it. So I'm just trying to give you the best I can, right? In the passage in section 2, which you're talking about, right? Where she says that it's not that they didn't see blacks, it's that they didn't see slavery. And she says that this wasn't based in a personal failing, it was based in the nature of slavery. And what I think she means by this, right, is that um, when we have slavery, which we've had throughout history in different kinds, right? We simply don't see the slaves. Um, and that's true for um all kinds of slavery. And that slavery erases the humanity of the slaves. And that's she's saying is not based on personal motives, it's based on the structure of slavery. I don't know if she's right, but I think that's what she's arguing. Um, uh, and she's also arguing that um, many of the founders, uh, were either um, some of them were abolitionists, but mildly so. But they weren't people who were engaged in what she would call brutal deeds, right? And remember that famous line at the end of chapter um 6, I think, of Origins, where she says there's a huge difference between sort of men of fanatical and crazy ideas about race and men of brutal deeds. Um, and 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 that's a big difference for her between racism or anti-Semitism as an ideology and anti-Semitism as a as a anti-Jewish, and same with race. And so I think what she's saying, right, is that it was more the structure of slavery. I don't think she's going to. I don't think she would deny. Although let me be honest, I don't know. I don't think she would deny that many of the uh, people involved were out and out racists. Um, I don't think there's anything in her work to suggest she would deny that. But I do think what she's saying is that while racism probably played a role, it um it wasn't the only thing, and that slavery itself had a structure. It has a structure that makes slaves invisible, and that was a big part of what was going on. She calls it the primordial crime, and it's not like a defense of it. And she thinks that the inability to see the misery of the slaves is one of the things that imperiled and, in the end, corrupted the American Revolution. Um, but I think that's how she sees it. Um, in what we're reading today, this idea that we have to be very careful about motives, right? I mean, I've thought, as I was reading this and even talking about it, I was thinking a lot about, on the one hand, there's the side that says, you know, if you're gonna, you should pay attention to what people mean, and the other people say, no, all that matters is the effects of what they say on people, right? This was the cancel culture debate, right? She's on neither side of that, right? She doesn't think you should pay attention to motive, but she also doesn't think you should just pay attention to effect on the victim. She thinks she thinks that once you get into this question of motive, um you've entered an area that really is one that we can't penetrate, and it leads to suspicion of everybody. And if we are going to be suspicious of everybody, she thinks um uh politics becomes a politics of rage rather than a politics of reason.
And Roger, I would, because I know that people want to get it, and so
Yeah.
that we can literally, I want to demonstrate what I think this discourse is asking. I am having difficulty swallowing that aspect of her analysis. I have great respect for her. I think there's a lot here. So to participate in it, we have to do this thing, which I think you're saying about being suspicious of motives. Let's get past your feelings right now, Bill, and try to understand the larger intellectual casing of what she's getting at. And I thank you very much for entertaining it. I see that if some of the reactions that people are having different reactions. And thanks, Roger. And I do agree. It's a great book. It's difficult to swallow, but it's okay.
Oh, I
I
mean,
think I'm
I want to
satisfied.
I want to be very clear to you, but also to everybody. I think this is a central question in the book. And I think it's something that should be interrogated. Um, uh, I think she's making a fascinating point. Um, by the way, she goes the other way, right? She also says, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, she says at one point, there was a weakness in the American Revolution that they seem sort of weightless and they seemed almost being it doesn't have a kind of endurance because they're like in an ivory tower and they didn't deal with an aspect of reality. And she understands that as well. Um, and and so I think this is a very I think when you try and really understand the complexity of what she's saying about slavery and racism and the American Revolution, it gets very complicated very quickly. And it's too easy, as some do, to simply say, oh, she ignores the question. She doesn't. It's also too easy, as some people who defend her would say, oh, well, she's just saying, if you don't if you don't look at the miserable and slavery, you end up with freedom, and that's better. That's also not what she's saying. She's saying there was a tragedy, there was a primordial crime here, which in a sense poisoned the American Revolution, even though it also enabled it. And I think that's the harder thing to grasp.
But I think we can move on, Roger.
Yeah, no, I'm going to move on. I just want to,
Thank you very much.
I
Thank
think
you.
this is
Thank you.
central to understanding her. So I just wanted to make it as clear as I could, which I'm sure is not clear enough. So I apologize if I don't get it all right. Jason.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe leap off from that back to section 4. This is also picked up, it's been very frothy in the chat on the question of what is the wellspring of solidarity? Is it the land or citizenship? How are we to overcome dehumanization of fellow citizens absent sentiment? If we don't have sentiment, how can we get, to humanizing them? Or is this purely a pre-political question, something we
No,
maybe fire ourselves?
no, I mean, I think this is an essential question. Um, uh, Solidarity, she says, is based in the rational idea of the grandeur of man or the dignity of man, right? Um, it's the idea uh, that there is something about human, uh, and or as she says, men or Americans or Germans or Frenchmen or um uh Kenyans or Chinese or whatever community you're in, right? That there's something um uh in each of those groups that is universal. That all men, the strong, the rich, as well as the weak and the poor, who are Americans, are part of the community. And it's finding um, a, a community of interest that is our community of interest. What holds us together as um, Americans? What holds us together as Frenchmen or Chinese people? Right? What is that connects us? And what she says is it can't be suffering, because that's not of the weak or the poor. It can't be the power of the rich. It's got to be something that connects us all. And she talks about it as a principle versus a passion, right? So some of you, I'm sure, are aware that in a lot of her work, especially in her reading of Montesquieu, she's interested in this question of what a principle is, right? As opposed to here a passion, but also other in other interests or mere economic or other interests. And what the principle here is that she thinks that what holds what the rational interest in humanity that she thought the founders in America grasped onto as a principle was freedom. Freedom for all. Freedom to be Mormon and freedom to be Jewish and freedom to be um, uh, to be a political uh, participant in self-government, whether you were rich or poor. Um, Obviously, and by the way, there were, um, there were citizens, black citizens in some northern states, but it was largely ignored. And I think Bill's point about the racism inherent in America, which allowed them black people and women and Native Americans and others to be um, uh, excluded, is real and was real. Um, but for her, solidarity is based on a principle that should not that should include all people in that community. Um, and that's how she imagined it. Um,
So is the key word there then interest?
well, it's the interest, it's the rational interest as opposed to the passionate interest. If you'll let me make that distinction, it's the interest that um, we all hold as being equal citizens, which of course we will never fully achieve, but which we aim at as a limit. I talked earlier about the difference, and this may be too much inside baseball for those of us who don't study political theory, but I mean, this is to me the radical difference between a Kantian and a Foucaultian, right? A Kantian knows that there is no way to achieve the law or know the truth, but still aims at it. And a Foucaultian says, well, therefore, we have to just constantly uncover all the hypocrisies and all the deceptions and all the powers. And the only way to be free is to constantly discredit any power. That's the kind of radical critique that she is obviously opposing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bernie. Bernie, you're muted, so you're gonna have to unmute and start over.
Go. Sorry about that. There's something I find somewhat dispiriting about this book. It's clear that the French Revolution has brought social justice into the political sphere. And as she makes clear, talking also about the Russian Revolution and all other revolutions, it's a part and parcel of modernity, is the social justice issue in politics. But she doesn't have any good answer or even suggestion of how to deal with it. On page 81, she talks about the French Revolution opening politics to the poor and saying that household issues have now come into politics. And this says, and this is her word, these are matters of administration. But if they're matters of administration, that's matters of bureaucracy. And one of the greatest critics I have ever read of bureaucracy is Hannah Arendt. Where do we go from here other than slam the book shut and shake our heads?
So Bernie, let me just ask you a question. When you say she has no answer, you mean she doesn't have an answer to the social question?
She doesn't answer not to the question of how we incorporate the social question into politics. Because I mean, it's clear while she doesn't come out and say it, it's not going away.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, great. Thank you, Bernie. I mean, it's a good question. Very good. These are all great questions. So, love the quality of what we're here doing. She has an answer, right, to the overarching problem, which is that politics should largely focus on solidarity in the sense that I was just explaining and talking about with Jason, solidarity as a rational community of interest, focused on the grandeur of Americans or Frenchmen or whoever. But Bernie's asking, I think, the follow-up question to that, which is, well, that answer does not satisfy me, and it shouldn't satisfy you, and it shouldn't satisfy Hannah Arendt, because, well, what do we do with the social question? It's still there, and you can't say that the social question is unimportant. And I think you're right, and I think she would say you're right. And when she would and when she says that the social question is a question of a matter of administration, I don't think she means bureaucracy, although I understand why you would say that. Um, I think what she means is uh, once you once you have once you have a free people, and once you have a free institutions, and you treat people equally, um, one of the things we should try and do is, to the greatest extent possible, uh, alleviate suffering where we can. She doesn't think you can alleviate all suffering, right? She thinks this is a mistake. Although she does say, right, that um, traditionally, I mean, she says in ancient society, the way we sought to alleviate suffering was through slavery, right? Of course, not a racialized slavery, but a slavery, because the idea was if you had slavery, all the people who were citizens could have their needs met by their slaves, and therefore could participate as equals in the public sphere. Um, she actually says, I forget where she says it in this chapter, but in what we read today, she says, today there's a chance of doing that without slaves, right? Through technology. There's a chance that increasingly we could use robots and technology, or chatbots, or AG, whatever it is, to limit and take away our and provide everyone with food and housing and whatever the social needs in a way that would be uh, allow them to have their needs met and focus on freedom and politics. Uh, I think it's a fascinating argument. I think it's not wrong. I think there's a decent chance that you know one of the things that will happen is that we can feed everybody if we want, and we can house everybody if we want. Um, Problem is, do we want to, right? A, and B, if this what she if you accept her reading of the social question, Bernie, right, and of hypocrisy and the passion of pity, what she says is that no matter how much of the needs we alleviate, there will always be, it will never be enough. There will always be more, because what people want is actually not solving the problem of needs and suffering, but they want there to be they want there to be pity, and they want there to be the poor, and they want there to be the weak, because they need that sense of hypocrisy and the moral virtue of being an enraged anti-hypocrite in order to justify their power. And so, you know, uh, I mean, this goes to the question of, so much. We're constantly talking about want and suffering, and there is a lot of want and suffering in the world, and yet it's at least it's not like it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. We do have a basic welfare state around most of the Europe and the Western world. And what does that mean? What is the problem of want today? And I think that's a question she raises. That's a political question. The question of how to address it, she says, is simply one of administration. How much we are willing to spend on it, and then administer it. But I think you raise an important question, and I think she offers an answer to it. It may just not be an answer we like.
It seems I'm having a hard time seeing what I'm stumbling for words here. What I seems to be saying is, what you seem to be saying is there is the possibility of expanding the political space to deal with these issues without sacrificing freedom. And I guess my question, my final comment is, I'm not sure she thinks that's possible.
Well, I think she thinks that it's possible you can expand you can have the political space to focus on freedom, but she thinks that as technology increases, right, there will be uh less, and that the what we call suffering changes, right? What we call suffering today are people with a house and TVs and car and things, right? And I'm not trying to make light of this. I think it's serious, but I mean, what we call the poor today would have been considered the ultra rich 3 or 4 or 500 years ago, right? And so what she's saying is, you know, the question of suffering is not one that can go away, because we're in a sense committed to suffering. We need suffering in order to, because our politics is driven by it. Um, uh, and yet we can continue to technically make people's lives better, and we should to the extent we can, but we shouldn't confuse that with freedom. Let me move on, but I understand it's not always a satisfying answer what she says here. Jeff.
Hey, Roger and everyone, thank you. So my question, which is maybe a rambling collection of them, takes off exactly from where you were. And it's this last page where she talks about technology has refuted the old and terrible truth that only violence and rule over others could make some men free. And I would wager that the word revolution in the last 10 years, when used in media or whatever, has been predicated by the word tech. So I have a question about the tech revolution, um, she might see it as a revolution. It's certainly radically changed power dynamics. It's changed the way time and space, access and connectivity around the world has worked. But it seems to be complicated, right? Because a lot of it's driven by a kind of libertarian point of view, which preferences liberty as in some way. It's very universalist, maybe for hypocritical justifications, but it is linked the world, and part of its dynamic is that everyone will be linked in some way. Barriers to entry have dropped incredibly. We now see people getting incredible power who, as individuals, who otherwise would never have had a voice. At the same time, some of that's through online personas that may be masks, may be duplicitous. Um, the law that they're concerned about, many of them, is pretty much just intellectual property law or basic commerce. So I'm just trying to figure out and maybe we can't answer it. Are these qualities of revolution? Are they more French than anything, given who's involved in the justifications? Um, or is this not a revolution? Is this closer to the electrification argument before Lenin goes? So anyway, there's not really a thing, but I keep thinking of tech before revolution when she's talking about revolution in general, and that's what is it a revolution? Would she say that? Do we know that?
Thanks, Jeff. It's a great question. I think that uh uh the driving force of the tech revolution, right, has been, as you rightly say, social. Uh, I mean, it's mostly been around providing wants, shopping, um, social media. I guess porn is the biggest issue. Um, uh, and it really hasn't, it hasn't really imagined itself as something associated with politics or freedom. Um, I think there's so yeah, I think that would be largely how she would read it. Um, uh, Part of that is I think that, well, I mean, I'll just say this. I mean, and I'm not going to get into this, but I'm sure some of you know who Alex Karp is, right? The founder of Palantir, or the owner of Palantir. He wrote a book earlier this year called The Technological Republic. Um, in which he argues against that vision of technology and as a social revolution, and argues that technology is going to, in a sense, um, open up a conflict amongst the world powers, uh, primarily between the West and China, in his minds, that will require a return to a clash of political values, and that it's important for the people in the tech world to choose sides and choose, in a sense, in his view, American democracy versus China. I think that's way too simple, um, and I think Arendt would be uh, suspicious of a lot of what he says, and yet I think in some way uh, there is a sense in which um, uh, his call to rethink tech on more political as opposed to social grounds is something that's meaningful. There's another version of this going on, uh, led by people like Audrey Tang out of Taiwan, who are trying to really use technology and AI and its advances to reinvigorate pluralistic democracy. Um, I think that's also an attempt to uh, use technology in a non-social way that would be quite interesting to think about. So, I think there are people in the tech world who are trying to um, think technology outside of its simple matter of efficiency and libertarianism, but there's certainly a minority, as I would understand it today. So
Thank you. I'm glad Zoom is something they've invented. So thank you.
exactly, yeah, there you go. Well, Zune has its own issues. Yeah, I mean, just think about this fact that we see each other in these little boxes, and I can't ever see your eyes, and there is a kind of obviously an incredible power of Zoom, right? I'm not going to deny that, and yet there's a way in which it sort of dehumanizes us in our little boxes. That I'm sure at some point we'll suddenly be talking to each other through holograms where we can gesture and look at each other and stuff. I don't know if that's 5 years away or shorter, but we'll see. Imagine us all sitting in a classroom being able to walk around each other and stuff like that, from wherever we are. Uh, it's not that far off. John.
Um, I'm interested in the idea of personas, and I'd- I'm wondering if this is helpful. We have a private persona, um, which is complex and dark, perhaps even to ourselves, relatively obscure to others, and that is concerned with our personal interests. Then we have a public persona, um, which is more open, not obscure. It is what we do and say in public. Rather than being concerned with our private interests, it's concerned with the public interest, or what we also call the public good. Um, so that our public persona is how we appear in public. And therefore, our motives should be attached to what is directed towards the common good. Um, that's all I'm saying. Because both are masks. Persona means it was the mask that the
Yeah.
actors wore in the Greek stage, and the word for actor was hypokrites. That is the word we get hypocrite from. Um, so that's all. Our status, our public persona, is that of the citizen, and it should be open uh, and perfectly clear. Uh, there may be private motives that are dark and that perhaps are even unknown to ourselves. But the motives that we state as citizens should be open and perfectly clear and well stated.
I think that's right. You know, I think for her, and I don't want to say motives don't matter at all. I mean, obviously we always are going to care to some degree about motivation, but I think she believes that motives are always contested and obscure, and you know, um, we should really treat each other with respect as citizens and as people uh, as we appear in the public. And everyone gets that right and is afforded that right to be an equal citizen of the public. So yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
Thank
Simple.
you. David. David? Oh, did he disappear?
No, I'm here. All right.
Okay, hi.
Hi. Um, so I wanted to kind of see what I could integrate some stuff here. The role of slaves, as the previous last two speaker before this one said, has now been taken over by technology, machine technology, and that's remaking the real world. It's not not political at all, and this it's just has completely remade our lives, and it wasn't legislated even at all. Just it was happening through business and other interests, whatever. And so that's revolutionary, but different from anything she's talking about, political. The political revolutionaries, and she doesn't talk about the Chinese communists much, who I think are much better examples in some ways of how this works and why, but they killed the landowning class, 20 million people, in order to institute this revolutionary change, to in fact solve the social question. And in large measure, they did solve the social question. But the way they did it was to have once again, a unitary solidarity within China, that we are all working together through, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, and they were regimented everybody, but in fact, they've gotten fantastic results by doing that. 800 million people raised out of poverty, okay? And on the other hand solidarity is non-violent. There's no, if you're trying to attack somebody else, you're not into solidarity, period. You're denying their humanity. You don't want to kill other people or hurt them. That's what the other guys do. But if you're into solidarity, you don't do that. And it's inherently non-violent, okay? Now we have sufficiency. We have a possibility through technology to end not just material goods, but also to educate, to do art training. There's plenty of money. It's all going into the military, which is what we have to change, because that's actually 100% against solidarity, is all the money, trillions, that are going to the military. We can feed, shelter, healthcare, educate, and employ every human being right now, easily. But we're not unified collectively to do that, to realize we can. But at the UN, that I've said before, they're talking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which can deliver universal sufficiency. And that, as world citizens, we don't have that kind of structure now, but through the internet, there's actually several very active proposals about how the citizenry of the world could vote that are wired in. Definitely. So and we can start developing a global policy and
so David, just can I ask, is there a question that you're asking, or is it more of a comment?
That is, I'm trying to get to some answers, and Arendt is just a little early to realize that technology will deliver sufficiency. There are very big issues about tyranny through technology, no question about that, but it will can solve the social question. In 1789, well, you sure in hell couldn't do it. But now, we can do it. We have the power if we operate collectively to take care of
thank you.
social
Yeah,
needs.
I'm not sure. We can we can certainly make it so that everyone has food, right? If we wanted to. But obviously there will be different qualities and different labels and that I'm not sure that solves the social question. It may solve the question of starvation if we wanted to, which we don't seem to want to. Um, but
But
yeah,
we is why.
well, it depends who the we is, yes, but you're right. Thank you. Robert.
Well, I know we're almost out of time. I have almost as much a comment as a question. I find it very useful that Hannah Arendt has set up to really oversimplify these two poles of a French Revolution and an American Revolution, one out of the desire to take care of abject poverty and to seek happiness, and the other to set up some polity that enables freedom. But it seems to me there are so many of the revolutions in the world are somewhere on this spectrum where those two objectives are often mixed. So just to pick an example, where would you put, for example, the Iranian Revolution? The Iranians were not in abject poverty. They weren't starving to death. And the purpose of the revolution was theoretically based on this kind of a religious ideal. So it makes me hunger for a kind of conversation or a discussion where we would have this kind of matrix of these, or the two ends of the spectrum, and try to talk about the different aspects of the different revolutions that have happened, both in her time and since, and where they fall, where the dynamic is between those two. Because it seems like many more of the religions or many more of the revolutions that we see are some hybrid of these
Yeah.
two poles.
Thanks, Robert. It is a question, not just a comment. I'm not sure how qualified I am to talk about the Iranian Revolution, since I have to admit what I know about it is not that much. But so let me preface what I'm about to say with that and say that I don't know if she would even think of the Iranian Revolution as a revolution. Because for her, a revolution has to at least seek freedom or to found freedom. And I think she would see the Iranian Revolution as the rise of a kind of ideological totalitarian state, much like what she saw Soviet Union was or Nazi Germany was. Again, I say that not knowing a whole lot about it, and I could be wrong. But that's how I, at least on the top of my head, would imagine it is. So I hope that's helpful, or maybe it's not, because it may be ignorant.
It's helpful, but I still am interested in this idea that many revolutions don't fall easily, are somewhere are hybrids.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I mean,
Yeah.
Hannah Arendt always is a thinker of distinction, but the distinctions are not absolute, right? I mean, look, we're going to get to chapter 6 eventually in this book, right? And she's going to argue that the American Revolution failed for a number of reasons, one of which is that it became too concerned with happiness and not freedom. And the French Revolution began and was imagined as a revolution of freedom, and she thinks that what became dominant in it is happiness. I think all revolutions have to have both elements in them to some degree. But it's a matter of what's the dominant idea. All right, let me try and just get one or two people
Thank
in.
you.
Lee and Denise and Kathy. If you can just quickly state a question and I'll see if I can answer them. Lee, can you do it like in 20 or 30 seconds, each of you?
I think Kevin is next. And
Oh,
if I remember it,
Kevin? I don't see a Kevin on the board, but I may not have it. Kevin?
are you there, Kevin?
I'm here. Yes.
Did you have a
Can you hear?
question?
Yeah.
state it
I want to get your
very
thoughts on
quickly.
public opinion polling. Last week there was a discussion about Democrats not thinking. And I've been thinking about why is that the case? And then this week on page 83 of my edition, I read the rule of public opinion was a form of tyranny.
Yeah.
And if you've ever done a public opinion poll, your opinion is limited from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And I think this way of thinking limits our ability to think in revolutionary ways or ways that can lead to a resistance to MAGA or Trump.
Yeah. So
Um,
let me
so just wanted
answer
to get
that.
your thoughts
Yeah,
on that.
let me say that something quickly about it, right? There's two different kinds of thoughts I have about public opinion. One is in the Arendtian vein, right? The whole premise that there is an opinion of the public is she thinks tyrannical, right? For her, the public is plural, and there's not, there's not one public opinion. And the idea that somehow through public opinion polling or through whatever means of finding public opinion, we're going to know what the public thinks, and that there's like one opinion is against the entire premise of of small r Republican Democratic thought. There's also another way of thinking about public opinion polling, specifically where James Fishkin, right, the Stanford professor who wrote a lot about public opinion polling, says that public opinion polls measure what people think when they're not thinking. And just you ask them, and they're not very thoughtful, and they just largely measure what the prejudices of the moment are. And he's trying to find more accurate, better ways of finding public opinion, and I support him in that. But from an Arendtian point of view, he still is caught up in what she would consider to be the mistake of public opinion, that there is a public opinion, and she doesn't think there is. Lee, let me let you ask the last question because I know you've been patient.
Okay.
And
Okay,
quickly, though.
thank you. This question really points to the relevance of Arendt's thinking for today's world. And the question is the lack of duplicity on the part of Trump? Arendt does refer to the duplicity of hypocrites. He's made perfectly clear what he was going to do once he became president. For example, retribution against his opponents. And is that part of the attraction that the MAGA people have for Trump, although Trump is a hypocrite in other areas? And then should the duplicity of hypocrisy be distinguished between the duplicity of the liar, where it's possible to ferret out the liar?
Okay, Lee, I'm going to
according
answer
to
you.
facts?
I'm going to answer you quickly because we're out of time. On your second question, yes, the point Arendt makes is that there's a difference between the liar who lies to other people and the hypocrite who deceives themselves, and who actually thinks of themselves, comes to think of themselves as virtuous when they're not. Trump is clearly in the second category, right? He's someone who thinks of himself as virtuous, and thinks of himself as a truth teller. Whether he, he also spoke out of both sides of his mouth during the campaign, and some people thought he would only go after, people here without documents who are committing crimes, and they've been obviously they see him as a hypocrite or as a liar. But I think most people understood what he was actually going to do, and I think part of his attraction is his view is it's all about power, and there is no truth, and and I might as well. It's all about winning, and I'm gonna win, and we'll win. He likes that word win. I'm gonna win. I'm a winner. And I think there's, for some people, a certain refreshing honesty about that. Because they simply believe that everybody's corrupt, and their rage is against corruption more than it is against anything else. And I think that to some degree that is part of his appeal. But and I think Arendt understands that politics of rage as driven by the way in which the social question leads to hypocrisy as the greatest vice, and thus a kind of even brutal honesty of I'm a corrupt criminal, and why don't we all admit that the world is full of, all of us are corrupt criminals, and the point is to be the most corrupt and the most criminal and to win. And there's a certain way in which that's where the politics of the social question ends up in her reading. All right, I'm gonna have to end it there. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone, but we will. If you have a question and I didn't get to you, please jump in early next week. Feel free. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. We're gonna read the Pursuit of Happiness next week. A great chapter, a little bit more optimistic maybe, and we'll see you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah
Yeah,
Arendt.
is there
Actually,
is there a session next week?
no
Oh.
virtual reading group session, October 10th. You must
Oh,
be
so-
traveling, Roger. Sorry.
Right. So we're actually missing 2 weeks, right? 'Cause
So
then-
we're missing 2 weeks because then we'll see you all at the conference the following Friday.
Yeah, so that's right. I hope to see you at the conference on the 16th and 17th. If you can make it, or there's also you can join and watch virtually. And then we resume what on the 24th then?
On the 24th with chapter 3, The Pursuit of Happiness.
Thank you,
I
Yana.
just put in the chat, of course.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.